limit, and then some of the other wells that go 2 parts water.
My name is Robert Gelkison. I'm a registered geologist who graduated from the geology department of the University of Illinois in 1972. I then was employed from 1972 to 1987 by the Geologic Survey Division of the University of Illinois, where I performed basic research and development of groundwater resources across the state of Illinois. And I also performed research on contamination of groundwater resources. I have much experience in New Mexico on working with groundwater contamination issues at Los Alamos National Laboratory and at Sandia National Laboratory's Albuquerque facility. I have done a very fast review of this report by the EPA Region 6. Excuse me, I have to find the... The report is titled Simulated Mass Transport of 1,2-Dibromoethane in Groundwater of Southeast Albuquerque, New Mexico by Scott Ellinger. The report predicts travel times of the ethylene 1,2-dibromomethane plume, also known as EDB. As I said, it predicts travel time of EDB plume to important groundwater supply wells for the city of Albuquerque. The travel times are basically guesses because there's not sufficient data for accurate calculation of those travel times. And the report itself admits that. An important fact is the report admits on page 63 that there was not sufficient data to validate the findings of the robust computer modeling. On page 63, it describes uncertainties in the computer modeling and states, the discussion of modeling uncertainties is included to describe the main uncertainties that were encountered. Uncertainties were caused by data gaps, which required making assumptions during model construction and the setup of individual computer model runs. The main uncertainties revolving groundwater monitoring. I'm going to start again. The main uncertainties involve groundwater monitoring coverage. That means there were not a sufficient number of monitoring wells. Values for specified head boundaries. Those values require a sufficient number of monitoring wells. Future groundwater pumping rates and well locations. Potential installation of recovery wells, which has not been done, or one recovery well is installed but it has not been appropriately tested. And data for model validation. This last statement of uncertainties is very important because it's an admission that there wasn't sufficient data on the hydrogeologic setting that the EDB plume is located in to perform model validation. And validation of computer models is essential and should be part of publishing findings of a computer model in a report.
But would you on that last point, this was identified as a draft, right? I mean, is this something that they would say, that EPA would say, well, this is just a draft, we're going to continue to be collecting data in order to validate the model at a future point? Would that be how geohydrologists work in this case, or are they just sort of jumping the gun a bit?
they're jumping the gun. This report should be retracted.
Well, it's only a draft, so it's hard to retract a draft. It may
Presumably-
never make it to a report.
I mean, but if it's a draft, what could they possibly still be doing to revise it, to revise the draft? Because if they don't have the data now, are they acquiring that data? Do they have the right monitoring wells in place? I mean, are they going to be able to get that data to validate the model?
No, the monitoring wells are not in place, and they don't provide plans for installing the necessary monitoring wells and performing the important characterization activities to have accurate knowledge of travel time of this EDB plume to the Albuquerque supply wells.
They don't know where the front edge of the plume is to begin with. So they don't have an adequate number of monitoring wells to determine where the front edge of the plume is. And between that unknown area and the municipal wells, they don't have an adequate number of monitoring wells. The Environment Department wanted 33 monitoring well screens in nested monitoring well locations, 11 nested locations, and those were never installed. Kirtland Air Force Base agreed to install 3 monitoring locations.
Just 3.
Just 3, and that's in the latest package. Now they had installed monitoring wells previously, but NMED documents indicate that there's still not an adequate number of wells to determine the front edge of the plume. And Eric has also looked at some of these problems. And with regards to the actual data that they've acquired to make any kind of determinations about how fast this plume might be moving.
Their maps depict a pretty confident picture of the entire plume, including the front edge of the plume.
But it's all extrapolated. They don't have sampling for much of that.
Yeah, they're. I mean, help me understand, Bob. Like, if they don't know the location of the plume or the front edge of the plume, how can they, one, depict a map of the plume, and two, if they don't know where the front edge of the plume is, how do they predict that we've got 30 years until something they don't know arrives somewhere in Ridgecrest?
Well, that should have been a conclusion in this draft report. We don't have sufficient knowledge at this time to calculate a travel time for this plume to reach the 2 supply wells of most importance, Ridgecrest 5 and Ridgecrest 3. That's the fact of the matter. That shows by reading through the report and how they describe the fact that they didn't have sufficient data to calculate the travel time.
Yeah.
They didn't need to state a guesstimate of travel time. They could have said, we don't have sufficient information for knowledge of the travel time, and this is an important reason for performing additional work.
You were mentioning to me before that you've seen these kinds of reports from DOE, from Sandia, from Llano, that they write these reports with data that doesn't give them any solid confidence of something, but then they go ahead and offer some sort of specific date or fact that why are they doing this? And why not just write a report saying, here's what we don't know, here's how we need to figure out what we don't know. Why write a report that says we don't know this, but we're saying 30 years? Why do that? I don't understand why they do that.
It is an excuse for not doing the necessary work for accurate knowledge of groundwater contamination from these sources, like the fuel spill at Kirtland Air Force Base, and the groundwater contamination from dump sites across Sandia, with the mixed waste landfill as a prime example. Up at Lannell, a prime example of this is a large dump site known as Area G that's 63 acres in site and has operated since 1957 for just dumping of waste. And they've done computer modeling to calculate travel time down to the water table of the regional aquifer, and it presented a time of thousands of years, when in fact I am able to review data from wells that they have put in that show the groundwater contamination is already there. And they aren't even admitting to that data. Instead, the Lannell scientists continue to say our model shows contamination from this disposal site will not reach the water table for a period of thousands of years.
That's on a good day.
David, I just wanted to say what Dave was talking about. NMED asked for 11 locations for monitoring wells. The Air Force delivered 3. Wayne Bittner, who was the environmental engineer for the Air Force at that time, told me explicitly at a Water Authority meeting that the reason they went from 11 to 3 was because that's all the money the Air Force had in their budget. And that's not supposed to have anything to do with how those decisions are being made.
I thought that Kirtland Air Force Base was obligated to do whatever the regulator tells them to do. And
They
so,
are, but it's not how things work.
To say there's no money, that is a reality of budgeting. And it doesn't mean there's no money never. It might mean there's no money today because their end of their fiscal year is the end of September. And the federal government typically has to plan 2 years or so ahead, at least down at the executive level, to implement any kind of projects and so on, and to adjust whatever budget does come down the line. So it's not necessarily untrue what Bittner said, that he, at that particular day he looked in his wallet and there wasn't any money. That was probably true, you know, but it doesn't mean there's never any money. The important thing, I think, that needs to be brought out is that it's expensive, and what money's being spent does need to be spent in the best possible way by not just one person's opinion or one group's opinion, but by the best minds and people we can put on it, because it is a lot of money, and it's money that could go elsewhere in a obviously productive, we would hope, a productive way.
But
that could be debated.
I'd like to say something. They delivered 3 out of 11 clusters. There were supposed to be 3 wells in each cluster. About 25% of what NMED asked. A big part of what Bob's talking about is the data gaps is could have been filled had those wells been installed, because NMED had asked for them between the approximate known edge of the plume and the Ridgecrest well fields, and they would have been able to collect a lot of that data. So they'd have a better idea of true groundwater speed, how true length of time, all this kind of stuff. So, you know, this was stuff that was necessary, and it was necessary. And in the larger scope of what this thing's going to cost, those extra handful of monitoring wells are a drop in the bucket financially.
This is the #1 Air Force site in the United States for environmental problems. This is #1.
Kirtland?
Kirtland. So if you don't think people are looking at it, you're wrong.
According to what criteria would it be #1?
It's basically, there's a number of criteria that are used, but some of the top 10 criteria is it hazardous to human health and the environment? That's EPA's responsibility, right? Protection of human health and the environment. Is it hazardous? It's got a number of, I guess all of the contaminants that I can think of that are in there are hazardous. some are more hazardous than others, obviously, but you're not going to argue that EDB is not hazardous. Is there a pathway to human health? Yes, that's a big one. Not every Air Force base and every DOE facility has any kind of an immediate pathway to human health. This one has a clear, and this report brings it out, which is actually a huge negative for a certain number of people on the other side of the spectrum, because it says no matter what, the EDB is going to hit those wells unless you take very, very aggressive action. And so that's a major, major dispelling factor. So you've got to think of it as a process, and we want to be sure that we get the best team in there to oversee this so that the money that is spent, the data gaps that are claimed, are peer-reviewed as data gaps, and whatever money is spent, because you've got A, B, and C that you could spend money on, gets spent. And there is a budgetary consideration. There is not, we had a little discussion with Wayne the other day, and there is not a gold pot at the end of the rainbow that he can dip into. He does have financial constraints. And so no matter what, he doesn't have a blank check that he can write. And so it's going to have to be done judiciously and most productively to get what is the mission of EPA. And I think you've got to keep that in mind: human health and the environment. And this violates both of those because all groundwater in New Mexico is considered drinkable. It comes under that category. So that hits the environmental, and human health in this case is perfectly clear. You can argue the degree, you can argue concentration, you can argue lots of things, but I don't see anybody drinking EDB at this stage. Well, there might be a few of you guys, but most of you are not intentionally. And so there's little question that it's a human health issue. And so when we rank a site, it's the mass, which they haven't, well, they've sort of identified. 24 million gallons is kind of sizable. Right?
Well, they didn't admit to the full
No,
size,
but anything they admit to is still sizable. You know, if we cut it in half, it would still be the #1 site. So it's sort of a stupid question as to whether it's 20, you know, from certain people's perspective. Does it really matter? You know, maybe Hillary's thing, whether it's 24 or, you know, or at least Congress's view, it's going to have to be cleaned up, it's going to be expensive, and it threatens human health and the environment, and it's EPA's responsibility to make it happen. And MED has primacy, but they're not in charge. EPA is in charge. They're the bottom line. The buck stops with EPA. That's why we have EPA. To have Kirtland telling us that all's kosher and good is about as ridiculous a situation as you can get. It's kind of like the chef telling you the food's good and it's burned. They have a vested interest, and you never would have a client, a responsible party, telling you anything about the site.
Well, I mean,
so it does rank number one
right.
for legitimate reasons, and there are a bunch of them.
But the surprising thing about the report then, though, is that although Ellinger does acknowledge the lack of data and the data needs, he doesn't then offer specific suggestions about additional monitoring wells and where they should be and how. I mean, shouldn't that be the conclusion of the report about how do we get the data we need, by when do we need it, and how quickly do we have to start collecting it, right?
Well, remember, we don't have Ellinger's work order. You know, Ellinger's work order was never put out for you to read, for you to read, for you to read, for me to read, for you to comment on. It was never put out, so we don't know what his job requests.
Well, there was a statement of purpose early on in the report.
Right, but we don't know what he was requested to do, and we don't know that he didn't fill that.
Well, we know he was requested to estimate the arrival of EDB to the Ridgecrest wells, because that's what he did, right? So he was asked to do that.
that was one of the goals.
Well, I think you need to see his statement of work.
But you're saying that he probably, might not have been asked, recommend what we need to do to acquire the data we don't have.
Well, what oversight did he have?
Yeah.
What was his work order? Was he told, you work with this data, you give us whatever you think? Did you have free will? Did anybody peer review it? Was anybody guiding him? Was anybody questioning whether he had sufficient data to do the report? You know, those are the underlying questions. And this is just one report that's in the draft stage, that's not been peer approved. And the paper is jumping on it for political spin. And, you know, you have to, this part of the report is not political, it's technical. This is the technical part of the report. And so the technical part is pretty clear. You know, you have procedures and steps that you do, and EPA has 1,000 documents about how to take a site through RCRA. This is a RCRA, and if you go to the web and look under RCRA and what you're supposed to do, it's very, very clear. And you need to look at those steps and those processes, and there are some shortcomings here. There are some legitimate shortcomings with regard to following the RCRA guidelines. And NMED with primacy can make the Air Force eventually do whatever they ask. They can fine them, they can take them to court, they can do whatever they bloody well please to make them, they have the authority, because under primacy they're basically EPA.
Well, one of the things EPA could have done, either under RCRA or under CERCLA, is to impose an emergency response program for this spill out there. And they haven't done that. Instead, they're issuing a report that, to all appearances, attempts to reduce the public anxiety about this. And it kind of comes on the heel of Citizen Action and Amigos Bravos submitting a request for an emergency response action and to list Kirtland on the national priorities list. So while one can only harbor the suspicion that this may serve that political purpose, I do harbor that suspicion.
It certainly worked that way for the Journal's editorial, which asked us not to panic and to take a deep breath and know that our water supply is safe and there's plenty of time to remediate. That was the way that the Journal interpreted the report.
Yeah, but that isn't what the report said.
Well, the report
The report never said relax, folks.
on the first
no problem here.
on the first page of the abstract, there's a statement to the effect that the amount that will arrive at the Ridgecrest wells will be less than what would amount to being 400 times the maximum contaminant limit.
Right.
And then what's not discussed in there is the fact that New Mexico limits for ethylene dibromide contamination in drinking water are 5 times as high as California. Now either New Mexicans are a lot tougher than Californians, or Californians are smarter than New Mexicans.
Let's clarify that point. EPA standards and New Mexico standards are the same. What California has is what they call a public health guideline. And what that, and it's on your site, and what that report says, that unless you take it from 50 parts per trillion to 10 parts per trillion, you still have a cancer risk. Very clear. And the reason at the time they put that out, that they said that there's a number of reasons that go into those. MCLs do not guarantee public health. They do not guarantee public health. It's a statistical number, it's a judgment number, and it's an economic number. And in the case of EDB, the feeling in California was, and it's in the guideline, was that the accuracy at that time that they could measure EDB instrumentation-wise was not necessarily up to the 10 parts per trillion, but they said very clearly, if you don't take it to 10 parts or below, you still have a cancer risk, without doubt. And so our public health guide is 10
Parts per trillion.
parts per trillion,
In
not
California-
50.
In California.
Right, and California is charged with 5-year review of all of these MCLs.
Yeah. But
And it's in a document, it's published, you can read all the logic, all the doctors, all the reasons, all the reports, all the NIH reports that show that if you don't take it to 10, there are NIH reports that it's a carcinogen. You know, statistical, but it's still a
But
carcinogen.
I've read those reports, and they don't actually. That number still seems arbitrary to me. That 10 parts per trillion, because they.
But it's laboratory based.
Well,
I mean, we
the
can
original
discuss-
EPA determination in the 80s, when they finally got around to considering EDB as a human health risk, was that no level, no amount of EDB
Right.
would be safe. Any EDB at all, regardless of the 10
Well,
parts per trillion.
That's their goal, their maximum health.
So that
health
seems to
goal.
me that,
So-
that 10 parts per trillion isn't much more, but it's,
But it has data to back it up. It has NIH data to back it up. The zero is a perfect universe. That's that we all live happily to whatever age we want. We have no health problem. I mean, it's an ideal situation. Why be exposed to anything that you don't have to? It's like a LoRa. Do you know what a LoRa is?
no.
As low as reasonably possible as the DOE guideline for radiation. They're saying, why should we arbitrarily expose public to any more than absolutely necessary?
But isn't the 10 parts per trillion really the lowest level that their instruments can measure, and isn't,
They can go below 10.
they can
now.
go below 10 parts per trillion?
And they can do 10 very reliably. And I can give you the name of the head of the largest testing lab, Test America, Bruce, and you can call him up and talk. He's a nice guy, like Jim, and you can call him up and chat with him. And that's they have 5 labs across the country that can do 10 with
Yeah.
no problem.
With respect to the reporting limits, the well that's monitoring well that's 200 feet from the Veterans Administration, which is monitoring well.
Oh, monitoring.
Yeah, which is monitoring well 1064. They list 28 parts per trillion, but then they put a U after it, meaning it's undetected. Well, when they can detect down to 10 parts per trillion, why are they listing this as an undetect at 2,800 parts or 28 parts per trillion? And they've imposed this artificial reporting limit standard that they have, and so all of the monitoring wells that are outside the area designated by their plume are listed at 28 parts per trillion. So they're not really giving a true picture of just how big that plume of contamination is. They only go out to 50 parts per trillion on their map.
Yeah, the map is what
Yeah,
claims to be.
And they justify that by that's all that NMED requires. Now remember, if NMED said show it to 10, you have to show it to 10. So if you want to blame anybody, it's not the Air Force.
For spilling it.
Well, no, they spilled it.
Yeah.
So it's not the Air Force for any data, it's NMED.
Okay, well, let me get back to Bob. Bob was talking about the lack of data. So I want to get back to these monitoring wells, and maybe you can help us understand this, because one of the interesting reactions I got to the Alibi story was from the Albuquerque Bernalillo County Water Utility Authority. And I put a sentence in the story in which I said, and this was based on the conversation that we had, that the wells, like in Ridgecrest, for example, they're not monitoring wells. And so
No, they're not.
if there were levels of EDB at dangerous levels, they wouldn't necessarily know it.
That's not quite true.
Well, let me
Yeah, you'd have to get your exact statement.
get my, and then I can't get online, so I can't.
But in this report, they show that the first EDB hits the Ridgecrest wells at 20 years, not 30. It's only when it builds up concentration to 50 parts per trillion at 30 years.
Yeah, but
That's
but
like
the
all
20
of the horses leaving
Yeah,
the
but the
barn.
20-year estimate is, it's ridiculous. It's full of data gaps. It's ridiculous.
We've got a well screen that's 800 feet long.
But at the rate we're going, it's 10 years before they even think about doing something. It's another 10 years to install it. You now have EDB at the wells, and it's too late.
Yeah, but Eric, you're talking about rate. I'm talking about direction. We're going backwards now. And let's get things going forward and then try and improve rates. We're going backwards with this stuff. We've gone from 7 years or less from NMED on when NMED, when EDB would hit. Now we're up to 20.
But some of the people at NMED said the plume wasn't moving at all. And
Well,
the EDB would never hit.
All right, let me ask you if this is an accurate statement. You tell me, because the Albuquerque Bernalillo County Water Utility Authority disputed this sentence. It said, if in the decades EDB lurked in the aquifer,
Say that again.
if in the decades that EDB lurked in the aquifer, it migrated into existing drinking water wells, we wouldn't know. There is no medical test to determine human exposure, and none of the drinking water wells have the technical capacity to meaningfully measure levels of EDB.
NMED said, or Water Authority said that?
Water Authority disputed that statement.
Well, it's a little vague. I guess I'd have to ask exactly what you mean by that, because when when you're not exactly technical, there's a lot of ways to interpret things.
Yeah.
And so,
Well, all right. So
what happens is you can have EDB coming into Ridgecrest 5 and significant concentration, but it gets highly diluted. You see, the well, here's the well. It only comes in from the side, and you're pulling water from 350 degrees, not 360, but 350 degrees, and so you're diluting it. All this water out here, the plumes back here,
yeah.
is clean, and so you're diluting it tremendously.
Plus, they're only sampling 1 liter every a month.
That's
So
why,
unless you shut
that's what I
that-
mean by meaningful. It seems to me that if you're interested in figuring out where and if EDB is found in a well, you want a monitoring well, not a drinking water well.
Well,
right?
why do you think EPA put out that? I mean, that's their guideline.
But
Why did they talk
what
about
you
that?
said the Water Authority disputed, there were several different statements within what you read, and I can't isolate which one of those.
It was that their drinking water wells, like the Ridgecrest, they disputed. They said if there's EDB, we'll know it, regardless of what Kirtland Air Force Base does. That's what.
If it's a 50 parts per trillion.
Yeah, I dispute their dispute. They are not doing adequate monitoring of Ridgecrest 5.
Well, you might ask Bob what he thinks
Yes.
would be a reasonable monitoring system for the Ridgecrest wells.
But it better be, because if they're not doing monitoring wells, it's going to be in the water well.
You've got a
Talk about
screen
that, Bob.
that's
Talk about that, Bob.
you got a screen that's 800 feet long. It's pulling in up to 2,000 gallons a minute. That's a tremendous dilution factor. So I'll leave it to Bob.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are very important data gaps at the location of the 2 Ridgecrest water supply wells that are on the pathway for this plume. And an important part about the pathway for the plume is that the report by Ellinger describes the pathway to be in ancestral Rio Grande River deposits, which are sand and gravel. So, and have a north-south alignment so that there is a direct line in fast pathway sediments down in the regional aquifer from the location of the plume northward to these supply wells. And that's a fact that's admitted to in the Ellinger report. Nevertheless, there are important data gaps on the time of travel of contaminated groundwater in that fast pathway zone. And an important data gap is at the location of the two Ridgecrest supply wells. And there are studies that can be performed to reduce those data gaps significantly. One study that's a low cost to perform is a geophysical study inside the production wells itself to measure the flow, the high flow zones inside the 800-foot long well screen. It's important to know where the groundwater is entering the well screens, especially near the top of the well screen. And that can be determined by performing using tools to do flow measurements inside the well screen. And that should be done under ambient situations when the well is not pumping, and also when the well is being pumped at its production rate. This will provide important information on the depth intervals inside the well screen that are producing groundwater, with special concern for high flow zones near the top of the screen. And so the flow logging should be performed in the two wells, and then that data should be used for installing a cluster of 3 monitoring wells close to each of those supply wells, between the supply wells and the plume.
What's close? Do you have an approximation?
I'd say within 50 feet of the supply well. The top screen should go at the water table. The second screen should go into the first high productive geologic layer within the depth of the screened interval, and a third screen should go at a deeper depth along the 800-foot length of the screen that's below a clayey layer that does not produce much groundwater. And this is another issue that's very important, is that they've calculated the speed of travel of groundwater into the well, assuming it has one property of permeability over the 800-foot length of the screen. And that is a mistake, because the flow zones are going to, in the geologic layers, are going to differ over that 800-foot length of the screen. And this is a well-known fact that's described in the Ellinger report itself. The Ellinger report has a lengthy discussion of flow meter logging that's been performed in 3 other Albuquerque supply wells. And the flow meter logging reveals layers of very high production of groundwater that are separated by essentially dead zones where there is no flow of groundwater into the well. And so it's not one layer of constant hydraulic property over the 800-foot length, but that's what they have assumed in calculating the rate of travel at the location of the wells.
Does that assumption reduce the travel time?
Yes, that assumption causes a prediction of a longer time for the plume to travel to the well.
And at the meeting in November, Kirtland described current work on, how did they describe that, Eric? They were talking about trying to map the hydraulic properties in this particular plume area. In other words, that work would serve to, if they had done that, then Ellinger would know what this closure looks like, where it's slower or faster.
Yeah, let me try to sort of add something. If you have a high permeable zone that extends all the way to the tip of the plume back here, obviously it's like a pipeline and you flow more quickly through that. What Bob is partially pointing out is that we don't have all of that detailed information. There's 2,000 feet, and the soil, for better or worse, is heterogeneous, meaning that there are, as the report points out, there are sand zones, which he was suggesting, that are very permeable, and there are zones that have clay that are very non-permeable. And so, if you're going to do a model, the reality is that, as I think Bob pointed out, but maybe you don't understand, is that there are a lot of assumptions, and they all should be peer-reviewed, because they all have an impact. And so this is one report. You do want the assumptions peer-reviewed, but and this is something you folks wouldn't necessarily understand, but what RCRA requires, or strongly requests and suggests by EPA and others in every state, all 50, is when you do a site, before you start this business of choosing a remediation approach, you have a comprehensive site model. And the comprehensive site model is one that's peer-reviewed and addresses all of the geology, all of the hydrology, all of the chemistry, all of the contaminants, all of the mass, all of the rates. So now and it won't be perfect, there will be data gaps, but it's been peer-reviewed. And that's a basic requirement of RCRA, and they have not produced that. In this case, Edinger produced his own conceptual site model that has not been peer-reviewed. Those assumptions have not been looked at. I'm not saying they're wrong. They could well be good assumptions. But it's like it's like two doctor opinions. They might be better than one because of a certain experience. Well, in this case, peer review means 10, 15 serious Bobs and others have looked at this and the different parameters that went into the model and checked it out. But to not have a conceptual site model, first of all, that's been presented to the public, has been presented, has been peer-reviewed, and to not have any real discussion of that prior to the beginning of a model puts that model at a very preliminary stage in the terms of investigating remediation, and a preliminary stage that goes against EPA's recommendations. They said you should use, in unison with all the good brains, the conceptual site model to begin your remediation strategies, to figure out and get your arms around the whole problem. And which technologies you're going to look at, which ones you're going to test, how you're going to do it, based on an agreed upon set of data. And that has not been done. You have a case where, according to that report, one person developed the concept, more or less, according to the report, developed the conceptual site model, made the assumptions, ran the calculations, and now everybody's jumping on the results.
Why are they doing it backwards then?
Why is Kirtland even talking about it? Because they're the responsible party. It would be like the prosecutor using the defense person to present his case. You know, what do you think he would say? I didn't do it. You know, it's not, in this case, it's not saying they didn't do it. I'm just saying the whole thing is upside down. And NMED and EPA are the ones that are responsible for getting if there are data gaps or not data gaps, getting peer reviewed, etc. We should not be seeing that report until it's completely vetted, until it's completely reviewed. It should not have gone to FLEC. It should not have been presented to the public because it may not be valid at all. You know, we may be wasting a good lunch. You know, we could have been discussing something meaningful. So it's premature, and it hasn't been done according to best practices. Let me put it that way. I'm not suggesting they violated any laws, but they're certainly not following the RCRA guidelines. And those are in there for a purpose, for exactly the purpose that Bob's bringing up in the discussion here. So when you don't follow the rules...
Does it disturb you that the regulators aren't following the...
I've mentioned it to Ryan Flynn. I don't think he's new at that job.
You're being awful polite here.
I don't think he realizes that the buck stops there. With primacy, the buck stops there until Region 6 takes it over and so on. And that's my recommendation is that, and I think they are reaching out to Region 6, but it needs to be peer reviewed by an oversight board that really knows and gets the best information and puts your handle around the whole thing. This particular remediation strategy of pump and treat is really untested in this situation. It's unpriced, it's unevaluated by whether it's even feasible. So you could be talking about something that's totally, I mean, you're talking about the color of chairs on the Titanic. You know, what color?
Well, the pump and treat involves billions of gallons of water
Massive amounts.
that would be removed
And
treated, and then what are you going to do with that water? Where are you going to dispose of it? There's no permits for it.
We're talking centuries, not
Where does
weeks.
that, if you put it back into the aquifer, where does that go in the aquifer? Is it going to move other contamination that's out there? I mean, there's a lot of contaminated sites at Kirtland Air Force Base outside of the jet fuel spill. With respect to the New Mexico Environment Department, you know, they've known about this spill of jet fuel out at the bulk fuels facility since 1992. So
Pretty soon it'll be 30 years.
so why have they delayed to the extent they have in imposing the necessary cleanup, the evaluation of the site, this kind of thing? We've got the biggest site of pollution underground in an aquifer in the entire United States. There's never been a single fine levy
Or a gallon
against the
taken out.
polluter, you know? And, you know, just as kind of an aside,
And you're worried about 30 years. Let's remind us.
the Secretary for the Environment Department is also employed by the polluter in the Air Force Reserves as a assistant judge advocate. So you've got a palpable, at least an appearance of a conflict of interest there, you know, that certainly ought to be examined during any kind of confirmation proceedings that come up for the Secretary.
We have just a couple minutes of tape left. Okay. Is there anything last we should, I mean, in terms of your conclusions on the report, Bob, that we might want to get on camera?
The quality of the sampling, Bob.
Yes, an important issue that needs to be understood is that the top of the screen in Ridgecrest supply well number 5 is 140 feet below the water table. This is an important distance. And that may provide protection to contamination of the EDB plume, which is up at the water table and to a depth of probably not greater than 100 feet below the water table, from even being a danger to contamination at the supply well. And this is a reason that there is a need to do an investigation by installing a cluster of monitoring wells close to the supply well. And there also needs to be a careful review of how the supply well was constructed, and is there an annular seal placed from the top of the screen up to the water table. I found a report that states that the annular space above the top of the screen was backfilled with permeable sand and gravel deposits. And this is alarming because that means that under conditions of pumping, contaminated groundwater at the water table could be drawn down to be produced from the well. So this is important. There are important data gaps which have to be resolved.
Bob, do you have an opinion of the USGS well that the Water Authority installed? Have you looked into that?
A serious mistake with the USGS monitoring well is that it was drilled with the mud rotary method using a bentonite clay drilling muds. That greatly lowers the value of that well for knowledge of groundwater contamination and for hydraulic properties of the geologic layers.